So good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along here today. I want to say a couple of things just at the start, and that this speech is really a joint effort between Brendan and myself. The research was done by both of us. Secondly, I want to apologise in advance. It's a little bit long. So this is an excuse if you did wish to go back to sleep. But I prefer to get my apologies in at the start rather than have to do so at the end. So having said those two things, let me proceed. Two centuries ago, China was the biggest economy in the world. 20 years from now, it will be again. If the question were to be posed, which country has done best by its own people over the past 3 decades, the answer would have to be China. A growth rate of 15% per annum, year after year, over 20 years is phenomenal. Yet that's what the Chinese have done. It had been argued by economists that consistent growth at this level was inherently impossible. But China has proven them wrong. Western economic sages predicted that China couldn't possibly maintain this pace of economic growth because it would lead to unsustainable inflation. It would lead to internal conflict as the disparities in wealth between the eastern seaboard and the western provinces increased. Society would tear itself apart. Increased personal wealth would inevitably lead to demands for Western-style freedoms, leading to mass emigration of the rich if it were refused. None of these things has happened. All the predictions were wrong. In terms of the scale of this achievement, no other country can come near China. The fact that economic growth started from a low level, indeed from a profound third world base, is sometimes cited as a reason why its accomplishments over the past 3 decades should be discounted. In fact, the reverse is true. It's the reason why Chinese achievements should be celebrated. Never in history have a people come so far, so fast, in so short a time as China. Never in human history have so many people enjoyed economic progress together over such a sustained period of time, in peace with their neighbours and in harmony with the wider world. Never in human history has a society gone through such profound social change at such a pace. The scale of the movement from the countryside to the cities, the sheer volume of rebuilding the cities themselves, the profundity of the transformation of the economic system from centralised planning to a more market-orientated economy, and the fundamental shift in social values, as expressed by Mr. Deng Xiaoping, his dictum, "to be rich is glorious," are individually without precedent. Collectively, they are beyond what Western economists, sociologists, and political scientists thought possible. The one-child per family policy, for example, is the greatest ever social experiment. That in its own would be sufficient to catch our attention and to stand us in awe. To understand what is happening in China, we need to put things in context. We're talking about a population of 1.3 billion. Actually, that number would be better understood if we said it for what it really is. That's 1,300 million people. And would be best placed in context if we remember that the European Union has a population of 500 million and the United States a population of just over 300 million. In other words, only a quarter of the Chinese population. To move such an enormous amount of people along the path of economic development and to keep them moving at speed without massive social dislocation required effort, organisation and mobilisation of resources never attempted at any other time in history. The scale of the success has been staggering. The economy is more than 10 times larger than when the current policies began at the party conference in 1978 under Mr. Deng. A decade from now, it will be the second largest economy in the world, and a decade later, it will be the world's largest. In terms of purchasing power parities, this is a technical term, it's already the second largest economy in the world and destined to be the biggest in a decade. Per capita income has grown by a factor of 8 since 1978. Some 500 million people have been lifted out of poverty. The number of city dwellers has doubled. The rural population has fallen from 82% of the population to 54%, the biggest migration in history. A McKinsey report forecasts that within 20 years, the population of the cities will have risen to 1,000 million. China is already a global economic power. It accounts for 14% of the world's manufacturing output and is the world's largest exporter of goods. Half of GDP comes from industry, the other 40% from services. Only 10% comes from agriculture. Now, half the GDP coming from industry, this contrasts with Germany, which is the biggest that I know of, where 28% of the GDP comes from industry. In Britain, it's at 14% and France at 12%. That's an index of economic maturity. China is running a balance of trade surplus of around $180 billion, whereas the EU has a trade deficit of $9 billion and the US has a trade deficit amounting to a staggering $225 billion. China has accumulated foreign exchange reserves of $2 trillion and is the world's largest creditor nation. China is the biggest consumer of copper, lead, zinc, nickel, aluminium and tin, as well as rubber, raw wool, cotton and major oilseeds. It is the second largest consumer of oil and by far the largest consumer of coal. When it comes to infrastructure, the numbers are just as mind-bending. Over 6,000 kilometres of expressway are being built annually, and 60,000 kilometres have already been constructed. At 64,000 kilometres, the railway network is one of the world's largest, while the merchant fleet is the world's biggest in terms of vessels. In power generation, China builds the equivalent of a new Germany in terms of power generation every year. It is the world's second largest importer of hydrocarbons. In terms of lifestyle, the story is just as impressive. China has more mobile phone subscribers than the EU and about the same number of internet users. It is still a long way to go in terms of personal wealth, with the GDP per head only 1/6 that of the EU and 1/8 that of the US. But imagine what will happen when China catches up with the US, in terms of car ownership, for example. The number of road vehicles would increase from 40 million to over 1,000 million. That is more than all the vehicles now existing in the world. In the light of these statistics, it's obvious that we are living through a unique phase of world history and that we need to stand back and reflect upon what's happening before our very eyes. A sleeping giant, as Napoleon called it, has been reawakened and has re-entered history. This represents a unique phase of history, if only for the reason that China has always been unique. After all, it accounts for 1/5 of the world's population. It is the oldest continuous civilization in a world and the largest and most homogeneous society. Over the millennia, it has led the world in science and technology, in innovation and discoveries, in mastery of nature, the conquest of the seas, and the exploration of the skies. 600 years ago, when Europe was just emerging from the Dark Ages and America was not yet discovered, China stood at the pinnacle of human achievement. For example, at this point it invented the printing press, the telescope, the clock, the compass, and printed currency. And of course, gunpowder and rockets, which it used for military purposes. At that stage, China also had what one economic historian called an unparalleled transport infrastructure of 28 national highways and 53 provincial roads, intersecting with the dense system of canals and navigable rivers, the cumulative result of 2,000 years of investment. Chinese fleets had already navigated and discovered most of the globe with the most advanced sailing ships ever built. These were great big six-masters. I don't know of anybody else who built ships that size. Even as late as 2 centuries ago, China was the world's greatest economic and military power, dwarfing the nations of Europe individually and collectively. Napoleonic France, Tsarist Russia, Wellington's Britain, and Frederick's Prussia. At that point, it accounted for 1/3 of the world's GDP. The demise of China over the following century and a half was also unique in terms of its scale and duration, but so too has been its resurrection, renewal, and reappearance on a world stage. To understand what is happening, we have to understand what makes China unique and why it will once again lead the world. Chinese culture has been examined to see how it has been able to accomplish the theoretically impossible and why it has been able to do so without being rent apart. It is important for the world to understand why the miracle of economic growth depends on the traditions, in particular on the values, indeed on the elements that comprise civilization. For me, the big surprise is that China has achieved all this without engaging in imperialist expansion. The one great power in the world to ever do this. The Chinese seem to have done something that we in the West have not been able to do. For example, they have procured the requisite raw materials for economic growth without strife, without invading anybody, and without deploying any aircraft carriers. And how has this been possible? To this Westerner, the answer lies in a set of values which has defined the Chinese civilization for the past 3,000 years. Above all, China is a civilization whose founding values are most easily found in the Analects and the other teachings of Confucius. Confucius said, "What you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others." This philosophical insight bears a remarkable similarity to our Christian Bible, what it says on the same subject. However, it seems to have been followed more diligently in China. Given that the greatest civilization on the planet has not made a practice of invading and slaughtering other nations, peoples and tribes, we can immediately see the real difference between East and West. The Chinese put more of their moral and social teaching into practice than is usually done in the West. The cornerstone of Chinese civilization seems to be the absolute centrality of the family and the workings of society. Another cornerstone is respect for government. But the Chinese construct contains guidelines as to how just government ought to behave. Looking at our philosophy, it seems an awful lot of emphasis placed on death and dying. Confucius spent a lot of time fleeing from people who wanted to kill him and staying alive, and how to do that, and immensely practical. He says, if you govern people by laws and keep them in order by penalties, they will avoid the penalties and lose their sense of shame. And if you govern them by moral excellence and keep them in order by your dutiful conduct, they will retain their sense of shame and also live up to this standard. There flows through the teachings of the Master a great sense of doing rather than talking about it. Though the odes be 300, one phrase can cover them all, namely, with purpose undiverted. I have to say that I found that the one thing in running a company that gives meaning and power to everything is a sense of purpose. And to find that flowing through Confucius is very interesting for me, because I hadn't realised it until I started researching. And he further says, I see and I forget, I hear and I remember, I do and I understand. There's a practicality in the values preached by Confucius. Whereas there is a religious component to his edicts, it's mainly with the building of solid, working, well-governed society that his teachings are concerned. The absorption of this philosophy of harmony into the very soul of China is what makes it unique and gives a civilization both its coherence and continuity. Viewed against this background, the Communist Party is to be seen not as a historical aberration, but as a continuation of the Confucian system of government. What was added to Chinese culture through the advent of the Communist Party on the national scene was that of 20th century materialism. It was a materialism influenced by the experience of many of its leaders, including the great Zhou Enlai, who as young men found themselves exiled in France around the time of the First World War. There they experienced the strikes and the lockouts that afflicted French society from the vantage point of workers, but also from being foreigners. They experienced exploitation from being at the bottom of the pile. They were thus amenable to Marxist teachings in terms of its analysis of class divisions and its prescription for class action. But the paradox is that the Chinese Communist Party is not Marxist in the classical sense, but it is materialist. It is also profoundly nationalist. The consequence is that society as a whole, under the Communist Party, remains heavily influenced by Confucius. Confucius didn't believe in profit, by the way, and that's the big change, I suppose, that Mao Zedong made. This is important because modern China has been shaped and moulded by the Communist Party, in particular by its leadership starting with Mao Zedong. To my mind, it's not possible to overstate the accomplishments of what were achieved by Mao politically. He unified the country, the many invaders were thrown out, the whole country was unified under one government. But whereas Mao was a great military and political leader, his economic record was defective and is not admired even within China itself. He did, however, lay the material basis for what was accomplished by Mr. Deng at the 1978 Party Conference. Mao modified Confucian thinking in the minds and the culture of the masses. He created the centralised power apparatus, the philosophical thinking, which resulted in the cultural acceptance of Deng's groundbreaking assertion that to be rich is glorious, a memorable phrase that we quoted before. Chinese society has remained homogeneous and unified in its cultural world outlook over the past 3 decades. Despite the huge increases in average wealth, the vast migrations of people, the great disparities in wealth. The Chinese people are still family-centred, still very much geographically China-orientated, and by and large satisfied with the government. And I understand why this is, because in my opinion, this has been great government in China. As I said at the outset, no government over the past 3 decades has done more for its people than the Chinese. A century and a half of foreign exploitation and humiliation have been ended, and the cycle of poverty broken. Now China is about to retake its leading position in global affairs. This time, however, China has a vital interest to what happens in the rest of the world. It was so rich in resources before it could actually get on with its own life without paying attention to the rest of us. Today's world is a different place from the world of 1421, which was a large part of the subject of my last lecture. The world population, for example, has increased since then from 375 million to a current 6,450 million. Well, that was the population in 2005. And it has been industrialised without regard for need to protect or respect nature. That's, by the way, is the world. The atmosphere, the land, the rivers and the oceans have been used indiscriminately by us and recklessly as dumps for industrial waste. It was thought that they could be used without limit and that they could be polluted without cost. Now everything has changed. Now we know differently. The atmosphere is the most obvious example of where the limits of human incursion on nature have been reached. Global warming is a phenomenon that only the most obdurate would deny and has progressed in proportion to the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere resulting directly from man-made activities. The rise in temperature has corresponded with the calculations of the climatologists. We now know that what is in store for us if we carry on with the business-as-usual scenario. The whole world is affected by global warming. It doesn't matter where the CO2 is put into the atmosphere because of the Earth's rotation and the uneven heating of the atmosphere by the sun ensure that the CO2 is distributed randomly. Humans consume 95 million barrels of oil each day. We burn 5,900 million tonnes of coal each year. And this releases in excess of 28.8 billion tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere every year. Every country is affected by this catastrophe. The effects are more obvious, however, in some countries than in others. China, in particular, is vulnerable. Classically, and all throughout time, 60% of China is categorised as desert, insofar as evaporation exceeds precipitation. This has been so from ancient times. The Himalayas are a major desiccating force. They dry out the winds that come from the south, from the southwest, and from the southeast. Sandy desertification, which is happening in China, is caused by climate change mainly, but it's aggravated by intensified human activity, particularly since the year 2000. The 5th biggest desert in the world is the Gobi Desert, with its whispering sands. But it is advancing on the Great Corn Belt to the northwest of Beijing. It can also be noted that there is a new desert forming now on the eastern reaches of the Himalayas. This is happening despite the tremendous efforts being made by China in the management of arid lands, and despite the fact that the shelter belt programs, which have been undertaken over the past 20 years, are bearing considerable fruit. One cannot but be impressed by the way China has managed to build railways across deserts. And a lot of these deserts actually have shifting sands, so I leave it to yourself to think how you might begin to do that, but shelter belt programs play a large part. And you can't but be impressed by the huge shelter belt programs in the middle reaches of the Yangtze River. Or again, countering the onward march of the Gobi towards Beijing, involving Tianjin, Hebei, Shaanxi and Inner Mongolia, with 75 counties in total, the comprehensive series of control measures have been instituted, and these include conversion of croplands to forest, afforestation, manual grass planting, aerial seeding enclosures, grassland construction, grazing prohibition, warm shed building, riverhead projects, water-saving irrigation projects, and, interestingly, eco-immigration involving 180,000 people. One result of these efforts was reported in 2006 as follows. Compared to 1999, the national desertified land area increased or decreased by 37,900 kilometres squared, or 7,600 square kilometres per annum. This is encouraging, but we have to remember that global CO2 emissions keep on increasing each year. It has been estimated that the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere increases annually by 1.5 parts per million by volume. Given that the primary cause of sandy desertification in China is climate change, it will become progressively more expensive for China to protect its people from this scourge. And we do not say it can't be done, we just say it's going to be much more difficult and going to cost progressively more all the time. Trying to defend China will become progressively more difficult as human-induced global warming progresses. There's yet another environmental threat to the prosperity of China, and I refer to the diminution of glaciers on the Himalayas. A lot of you will have seen in the recent past that there was a report published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and somebody alleged that the great glaciers of the Himalayas were going to be gone by 2030. And when that was published, it was clearly wrong, couldn't possibly be gone by 2030. And this has led to a lot of the sceptics around the world saying, well, climate change was always bogus from the beginning. But in fact, the assertion that the glaciers are disappearing is right, but the timescale is wrong. It will be disappearing within a century to a century and a half, which is an incredible thing. The main cause of the problem appears to be coal burning in India. The sooty black particulate matter, mainly carbon, gets deposited on the Himalayas, and instead of the snow and ice reflecting the incident radiation back into space, the black particles absorb the radiation and locally heat and melt the snow. This will lead to increased runoff of water in the short term, but could be disastrous for China in the next century. Imagine the state of desertification of China if the great river systems were to dry up or were to get threatened. The backbone of China's ecological infrastructure is the three great rivers. They will have to be protected at all costs. It could be said, of course, that rivers define civilization. They become the main centres of settlement and operate as great trade arteries. In that regard, the Himalayas are the lifeblood of China. If the flow of waters on the rivers speeds up, as it has done, as a result of the melting phenomenon, well, then this will have significant effects, as it already has, in terms of increased silting of the rivers, and the hydro dams become less effective because the water depth decreases. This, for example, will adversely affect the dams, and the generation of electricity will go down. This is a problem we've also seen in Chile, where the hydro schemes are progressively each year becoming less effective. When I look at the future, I see China threatened more than any other nation by the runaway interference with the atmosphere that is still going on. Perhaps not as much as the Maldives or as much of Bangladesh. They're just simply going to disappear under the sea. But if the great rivers were to get affected in China and the flow rate were to be reduced greatly, then the water needed for irrigation, industrial cooling and processing, for drinking and for naturally combating desertification won't be available. The very fabric of society and the basis of the economy will have been undermined, and history will have been reversed. China needs to act now to protect itself from global warming. I know that it is indeed doing so, and doing so with considerable success, but as we said, the task becomes more difficult every year. And I have a selfish reason for wanting China to act now. We in Europe have been ploughing a relatively lone furrow in trying to combat global warming. The EU has legislated that Europe will double its renewable energy sources by 2020. We will actually be making 34% of our electricity from renewable sources by then. We have piloted the know-how of making wind turbines, of photovoltaics, of concentrated solar, of long-range transmission of electricity using DC. More importantly, we have found out how to create a market for renewables. The renewable energy feed-in tariffs, which got wind and solar going in Germany, Denmark and Spain, are the fastest way of getting the new sustainable energy deployed in open market situations. But as was seen in Copenhagen, the voice of Europe was not enough to propel the world in the right direction fast enough. Something else was also observed in Copenhagen. China had and has a massive advantage when it comes to leadership of the developing world. It would appear to this observer that it was China and not the United States which commanded the respect of the developing world. And we should be aware that the US president only decided to go to Copenhagen when it became clear that the Chinese president was about to do so. The reason why China can lead the developing world is because it does not engage in enforced regime change, a euphemism for invasion and slaughter. Instead, China trades profoundly with the rest of the world, including the developing world, just as it did in the 14th century. Resort to the use of force or of invasion of surrounding countries, even when it was obvious that China could have done so. They had a standing army of 1 million in 1421, never really became a factor in Chinese foreign policy. I believe China's relationship with its trading partners to be altogether more civilized than we in the West pursued this past century with the Americas, Africa and Asia. I also believe this is what gives China the moral authority to provide leadership to the rest of the developing world. In terms of the fight against global warming, we need to be aware, however, that China is the largest producer of energy in the world and hence has the greatest responsibility to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. For that reason, I'm delighted to see that last year China became the fastest growing wind energy country in the world. The trend is clear. The cumulative installed capacity of wind has it's done another thing. It's doubled each year since 2004. By 2008, there were 12,200 megawatts installed in China. Last year, it installed 13,000 megawatts. While this was only 2% of installed capacity, the progress being made is not just encouraging, but has all the appearances of another Chinese miracle in the making. Some 80 companies are reported to be building wind machines in China currently, and according to a privately commissioned study, some 150 gigawatts of wind are likely to be built by 2020. Now, that would contribute to non-hydro renewables a mere 8% of generation of electricity, which we think is actually quite low. We've seen China propose the building of big new wind farms at sea. For a country which has been able to do incredible things outlined earlier, I consider 150 gigawatts to be on the low side in terms of ambition. What about a target of 20% by 2020 and 50% by 2030? That would make a gigantic difference to the climate and the world. In fact, that would mean the building of 450,000 megawatts of wind by 2020. I wouldn't even suggest that for any other country. But when I've seen what China has been able to accomplish, I don't think that's beyond their capability at all. It's the one country that can outperform Europe, where we grew wind energy at 30% a year over the past 15 years. These beliefs were reinforced by the most recent report from the Pew Charitable Trust, which showed that for the very first time, China's investments last year in renewable energy exceeded those made by the United States. In keeping with the incredible rates of growth elsewhere in the economy, a 50% growth rate was recorded for investment in wind, solar and other forms of renewables, with the total coming to 26 billion. And China has installed capacity of, well, there's some numbers, but just 52.5 gigawatts, 52.5 thousand megawatts have been installed there, most of that, of course, being hydro. In the last 6 months alone, China has concluded deals with American solar companies to build solar plants there, which will generate 4,000 megawatts of electricity. That's near enough the peak demand here in Ireland. On the negative side, however, 77% of Chinese power generation is coal-based. And despite these welcome developments, the fact remains that most of the new build in power generation is coming from coal. China actually mines something like 2,800 million tonnes a year of coal. This means that China is lagging behind the West in respect of the pace at which power generation is being decarbonised. During 2008 and 2009, new wind generation plant built in Europe and the US exceeded all other forms of new generation build. I should say that again. We now, in all of Europe and all of America, build more from wind than from any other form of generation. Gas is next, but wind has overtaken all other forms of generation. We believe we're going to see this happening in China, and there's going to be some staggering numbers there, but it needs to happen. China will have to do the same because the key economic variable determining greenhouse gas emissions will be electricity consumption. By 2020, domestic Chinese consumption will have grown faster than the global rate, and unless it is predominantly supplied by clean power, the greenhouse gas effect will be devastating. Added to that, the world economy will be on the point of scarcity in respect of minerals, hence the need for total sustainability regarding resources such as water and minerals. We are actually, the world is on a once-off transition to sustainability now. Every single thing that we use has to be capable of being reused. We have to think in terms of reusing it and reusing it and reusing it. And this applies especially to rare minerals such as platinum and phosphorus. The sea itself will become a critical consideration, and there will have to be a marine component to this holistic approach to sustainability. We need a new model for sustainable economic growth which goes beyond conventional thinking, and China will have to be at the heart of it. Economic growth will, of course, slow down in China. This is probably inevitable. But even more moderate rates of growth will stretch resources, and that is why there's an absolute imperative for shifting to the global sustainable model. This need becomes all the more acute when India is factored in as an additional source of demand, and this is not to mention Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, and South Africa. The sustainability model is all the more necessary because of food production. It is true that at present, China by and large feeds itself, even though only 7% of its land is suitable for agriculture. But that situation is changing because China has a huge and growing appetite for animal protein in particular, as a direct result in increasing wealth of the population. The Chinese are now big meat eaters, and the annual consumption has, for instance, gone from 20 kilograms per person in 1980 to 54 kilograms last year. Food consumption will continue to increase, and this is pushing China into major geopolitical deals. It has leased a large part of Brazil, for instance, for soybean production, which of course has an adverse environmental effect insofar as Brazil is clearing forests to do this. From a global perspective, China will have to find a more environmentally acceptable solution to providing its population with adequate food supplies. For our part, we in Ireland should prepare for the future in which China evolves into a dominant force in the world and becomes what it has always seen itself to be, the middle kingdom around which the rest of the world revolves. We should begin by developing an extensive expertise in the Chinese language and culture, and by developing intensive trade relations with its economic authorities, particularly in food, and especially in free-range beef, in which we excel as a clean and low-cost producer. I note a recent UCD study which identifies a growing need within Irish companies for Chinese speakers. I was particularly delighted to learn that the Loreto Convent in Bray is pioneering a pilot project in teaching Mandarin at second level, with great success, as we heard on RTE radio last week. I am encouraged to learn also of the interest within the Irish farming organisations and Irish agribusiness generally in developing beef and other food exports to China. The demand for meat will be insatiable, and we should aim as a central plank of our export policy to supply the Chinese market on the basis of a long-term trade agreement designed to bring mutual benefit to both countries. To do that successfully, we will need to have a coherent and consistent strategic foreign policy framework in which China becomes the centrepiece. But to be successful in this fundamental shift in the conduct of our foreign relations, I want to emphasise the importance of learning the language, because it's the key to understanding this great civilization. To have a second language, it's said, is to have a second mind. We will need that second mind in order to prosper in the future that lies ahead, one in which China is again going to lead the world in a relatively short time. In summary, China has to lead the world because it will suffer the most from global warming, the common threat that confronts all of mankind. China can build the technology, and it has the credibility to lead the third world in implementing agreed policies to mitigate carbon emissions. In my view, China will succeed in both developing the technology and providing the leadership. It will succeed because the central role which China's society has always ascribed to meritocracy. Throughout the last 3,000 years, it's the only example I can find that consistently had meritocracy at its centre. We've had various spurts of meritocracy in the rest of the world. But, the history of China shows that, if your daddy was a great man, it didn't mean that you were a great person. They didn't do things like that. You got very high in the bureaucracy if you were very talented. If your children weren't very talented, well then they slid down the social scale. I mean, this is really the only consistent example of where a meritocracy works, and I think that's one of the key reasons why they adopted materialism with the enthusiasm which they did. A culture which is focused not only on action but also on the need to retain wisdom, and hence to maintain respect for its elders, is guaranteed to succeed. The decades ahead will be even more dramatic than those which have just gone. China will continue on its path of economic development. It will raise another 700 million people to the standard of living already achieved by the rest of society. And it will lift the average income of the whole of society closer to ours in the West. It will do so by adapting its ancient culture to the needs of tomorrow. It will grow its own way in terms of political, social and economic organisation, a way that we in the West must respect and with which we must work and from which we must learn. The presence of China is now the most distinguishing feature of this globalised world. It is a process that cannot be reversed. It can only be embraced and turned to everybody's advantage. But I profoundly believe that all parties will only enjoy mutuality of benefit if there is mutuality of respect. With regards to China, that respect must be based on the understanding of its past, of its uniqueness as a civilization, of the scale of its current achievements, and the grandeur of the future that awaits it. And that's my message here today. As China led the world in the past, so it will once again in the world of the future. And that future is upon us. Thank you very much.